So North Korea built a beach resort? Yes, my friends, to say that there's a lot of mystery surrounding the Democratic People's Republic of Korea would be one of the greatest understatements of all time. The country that is better known as North Korea has been nicknamed the Hermit Kingdom because its unrivaled privacy and control of information. And along with all that secrecy comes a vast amount of misinformation as well as propaganda. But interestingly enough, the most highly secure nation in the world has recently planned, built, and opened up numerous tourist attractions, including open markets, hotels, and beach resorts. How did this happen? And what does it mean for the future of the world's most volatile dictatorship? Genuinely, what is actually going to happen right now? We're all kind of baffled by this. But for that, my friends, we're going to need to back up for some much needed context. Now, my friends, I know the reputation that I have when it comes to talking a lot. I get that. And if we went back to the factors that led to the creation of the division between North and South Korea, we would be here for quite literally hours. So we are going to have to speed run through the history of Korea a bit after the rise of Kim Jong Un. And so honestly, because topics like this are really hard to talk about, it's one of the key reasons why I am proud to be sponsored by Ground News. Because not only am I grateful to Ground News for being a longtime sponsor of this channel, which they have been, but simultaneously they are an amazing resource that I am able to use in order to remove as much of the bias as I can from my own reporting and talking about different subjects in history and geopolitics. There have been many different news sources that have been talking about North Korean tourism, and I am able to go through Ground News and I am able to separate them by left-wing bias, right-wing bias, sources that are in the center. I am able to see the factuality rating of the sources that are talking about it, because as we all know, some sources are a little bit more questionable than others, and most importantly, in my opinion, I am able to see who exactly owns the media that is presenting the information to us in the first place. Whether these are independent news sources, wealthy private owners, government sources, media conglomerates, or more, all of these things are going to shape the way that news is presented to us. Knowing where this information comes from is extremely vital. I myself try to remove as much bias as I can from my presentations to you all, but you and I can be better than we are currently right now. And if you want to support my channel, if you want to support independent media, then by all means, go to groundnews.com/historyofeverything, and you can get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the same plan that I use in order to be able to get the information that I get to present to you all in the first place. Even if you only try it out for a little bit, that still is a huge help to me, and you're likely to find out that this is great for you too. Once again, thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this channel. And now back to the show. You see, starting in 1905, the Korean Peninsula, which was one unified country at the time, was conquered, annexed, and then occupied by the Japanese Imperial Army for decades. For the next 40 years, they would endure harsh treatment and basically become slave labor force for the Japanese. The brutal treatment of the Korean people would go on to be one of the main reasons why Koreans have traditionally had a cultural dislike for the Japanese, which, considering the videos that I have done on, oh, why do Japanese and Koreans hate each other? Yeah, this is a speedrun explanation. Anyways, after the war, the United Nations decided to let the Russians administer the northern half of the Korean Peninsula and the United States to administer the southern half. And I know it seems like a travesty to skip over an entire war, but in 1950, the Korean War would break out. This war was between the Chinese and Russian-backed rebels, led by a young mercenary fighter by the name of Kim Il-sung. And over the next 40 years, Kim would develop what was initially a very tenuous situation in which he ended up on top into one of the most ironclad and authoritarian dictatorships in the entire world. Not just for him, for his family. A staunch supporter of communist and socialist ideals, everything in North Korea was passed through a prism representing the man in charge's personality. For instance, while most communist countries don't necessarily have a great relation with religion, Kim just so happened to be from an active Presbyterian Christian family. His father was a Presbyterian elder, and his mother was a Presbyterian deaconess, interestingly enough. His grandfather was even a Protestant minister. But due to the occupation of the Japanese, he would grow up relatively poor, and this would turn into a distaste for religion in Kim, who would blame religion as a tool used by Western imperialists to control the Korean peninsula. On that note, I just have to point this out here. Before 1948, Pyongyang was actually an important Christian center. The city was known as the Jerusalem of the East. And if you'll notice the timing there, it would coincide with Kim Il-sung coming into power and leading his country through the Korean War. And so it is there, in the ashes of war, that the North Koreans would find themselves during the mid-1950s, and here is where Kim Il-sung would make his most important moves. Purging. We're getting to communist purging and political machinations. In 1955, he would have his most important political rival, Pak Hun-yong, executed in the first of a series of purges that saw dozens of his rivals and critics rounded up and shot publicly. Then, in 1956, Kim would go and join Mao Zedong in the anti-revisionist camp that rejected Nikita Khrushchev's program of de-Stalinization that would occur after his death. Yet, that all being said, he refrained from fully becoming a Maoist himself. While Mao disagreed with Khrushchev on idealist and economic principles, Kim just really wanted to run Korea by himself. He favored the cult of personality that Stalin had developed and would model his own after that of the deceased Soviet leader. He would develop his own particular model of government that is completely unique and will cause me to use terms later that we've never actually used here on this channel before. It should be noted here, though, that while he publicly disagreed with the Soviets on this occasion and topic, he never took part in the Sino-Soviet split and would continue to remain on relatively good terms with the Soviets for many years, even if they couldn't fully control him. Along with this, also occurring in 1956, was the August Faction Incident, which was an attempted removal of Kim from power by the Yan'an faction, which was supported by the Soviets and the Chinese governments. In what must have felt like a real-life version of the Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney games yelling "Objection!", the Yan'an faction planned to call him out at the next Communist Party Central Committee meeting that was scheduled to occur in July of 1956. Kim, though, caught word of the plot against him and spoiled their plans to some extent by adding stops onto his 7-week foreign relations tour. Then, when he got back to Korea, he had the meeting delayed by a month to slow down their momentum. And then finally, the day came, and Kim shows up for the meeting flanked by a crowd of supporters. As the drama unfolds, a rival Communist Party leader, Cho Chang-ik, would make an impassioned speech in which he would gesture, point, and pound the podium and plead for the party members to listen to his call for action. He called out Kim for concentrating the power of the state into the hands of just him and his loyal supporters. Which, yeah, he did. He also railed against the fact that Kim was ignoring the starvation of the North Koreans that was starting to occur. Yoon Kong-hum would go and attack Kim verbally for creating a police regime. And mind you, this is a police regime at this time. It was something that was only going to get worse. And yeah, their arguments would have been pretty convincing in normal circumstances. But then we have to remember that this was nothing more than communist showboating. Kim's supporters would shout over the accusers so loudly that not many people could even hear what it was that they were even talking about. This was the geopolitical equivalent of a bunch of people sticking their fingers in their ear and yelling, "La la 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 la, I'm not listening, I can't hear you." Instead, Kim Il-sung's supporters would accuse the opposition of being anti-party and move to expel Yoon Kong-hum from the party. Kim would neutralize the opposition's efforts by calling for silence and then promising to make changes and reforms to moderate the regime, which obviously he never intended on keeping these promises in the first place. This would sway the party members to not only vote in his support, but voting to expel Cho and Pak from the Central Committee. And Kim knew just how to wrap things up for this assembly session then with another purge. So it was, my friends, that the blood began to run so freely in Korea that in less than a month, the Russians and the Chinese had to step in and tell Kim to please calm it down. Which, you know that things are probably going a bit overboard when the Soviets are looking at you and telling you to chill. Kim would pretend to agree and then call for another party meeting where he would publicly pardon the leaders of the Yan'an faction, but unfortunately for them, this was simply a move to buy time so that he could then round up the members of the Yan'an faction, and over the next year, he would systematically eliminate the members of it, executing them one by one as examples of what happened when you crossed the Kim regime. So it was then that by the time 1959 rolled around, the Yan'an faction completely ceased to exist. They were either dead or in exile, but mostly they were just straight up executed. This was Kim Il-sung's Consolidation of Power phase, and he would be so good at it that he would never seriously be opposed again after this in his time within North Korea, and really neither would his family. And so the lot of you who are watching this right now are probably wondering, okay, Stack, if this whole video is supposed to be about North Korean tourism, why are we talking about the Kim's family rise to power? Because what it is that they do to create the state that they do is vitally important to understand just how incredibly insane this is, that this tourism move is even happening in the first place, because it seems to be completely incompatible with the basic ideas of North Korea itself. You see, during his rise to power, Kim would create these central concepts that would lead his nation for decades to come. This involved bringing about the use of the Songbun System, which is a kind of caste system of sorts that consists of three separate groups. The first is the core class. This group, as you can imagine from the elites of society, would consist of those that belonged to families that supported Kim in World War II and the Korean War, and it also includes those with certain occupations that are considered to be essential to the regime and the state ideology, such as public officials, teachers, tenant farmers, army personnel, and Workers' Party of Korea members. This group also contains those that are considered the most loyal to the regime, and that is the key part here. They are the people who are least likely to defect and those who are considered most trustworthy by the government. The next class after them is the wavering class, which consists of those considered to be possibly disloyal because perhaps they had a Japanese grandfather or a cousin who was caught watching foreign media, but they themselves, technically speaking, have not yet done anything that threatened the state. These were mostly just your average citizens. The wavering class would also consist of those with jobs that were like small-time merchants, artisans, general laborers, anyone who had moved to Japan and then back to Korea, and like 15 other categories. It was the majority of people that couldn't necessarily be trusted with all the information that could be harmful to the state. The last group, though, these were the people that had the worst of it. The last caste was the hostile class, and this included anyone who had been a landlord, capitalists in general, pro-Japanese collaborators, party defectors, philosophers, families of prisoners and spies, families of those executed, and current and former prisoners. If you were a merchant, if you were a lawyer, or if you were any kind of Christian, you were automatically assumed to be in the hostile class, which was really bad. And so you may wonder then, okay, well, how did the government know which class that you belonged in? Well, they kept files on literally everyone. Yes, every single person in the country above the age of 17 has a file on them that is kept by the government. And that Songbun file is something that is updated every 2 years. And that is crucially important because here is where the problems would start. If your Songbun was bad, you were screwed in North Korean society. And what I mean by that is that one Songbun was used to determine everything about how you were treated in society. That includes the responsibilities that you were allowed to be trusted with, the privileges that you had, the jobs that you could obtain, and even how much food the government gave you. Songbun determined every opportunity to move up in Korean society, from whether you could go to a decent university and even where in the country you were allowed to live. And not only is that terrible, but the thing that really sucked about Songbun is that it was relatively difficult to improve one Songbun, but it was ridiculously easy to have it downgraded. Like, one could have their Songbun reduced for such trivial actions as not even being convicted of a crime yourself, but having a family member commit a crime, marrying someone of a lower standing or Songbun status, and even just having a lack of political enthusiasm. Like, if you have a cousin who didn't clap hard enough at the last rally, you yourself could get in trouble. Because of the baked-in groupthink that came about from the creation of Kim's cult of personality, even the smallest details about one's behavior could be something to be criticized. And you may wonder then, okay, well, hold on, who's doing the criticism? Are other people doing it? Yes, but also you, yourself. You're probably looking at me confused right now. Why the hell would I criticize myself? Well, that's just it, my friends. If you have ever seen the classic rite within Catholicism where you go to confession, essentially imagine a North Korean version of that, where every North Korean adult was tasked with attending regular life review sessions where you would go and admit to having sinned. Except this wasn't for general religious sins. This was having capitalistic thoughts or temptations, something that you would find yourself considering that was maybe wrong to think about the government. These are more commonly known in the West as self-criticism sessions, and they're one of Kim's most ingenious moves. And I mean that not in a moral sense, I mean it was incredibly intelligent for the type of police state that he was trying to create. Because you need to understand, North Korea is an atheist state. The people of North Korea have never really had a religious pressure valve where they are able to release some of the systemic guilt that comes with society and also from the regime gaslighting them constantly. It was always possible to be a better worker or soldier or something for the great leader, and it was your own flaws that kept one from improving their Songbun, not the regime's Many strict standards, of course. But even more importantly, because these weekly self-criticism sessions were publicly held instead of being a private confessional experience that one would have with like a priest and it went to no one else, every single moment became a public trial. It created an environment where one was expected to accuse others of wrongdoing publicly, and then they had to admit it and promise not to do it again. So instead of bringing people closer together, like what you would see in a church congregation or some other kind of service, these sessions would turn into brutal finger-pointing with terrifying potential real-life consequences. These self-criticism sessions were classified then by weekly, monthly, and quarterly review sessions. The quarterly had the most attendees, and the weekly would be smaller, more local groups. These sessions would regularly include people that were condemning themselves and others of all kinds of things, including such heinous crimes as not participating in organizational life with a big enough sense of ownership, not applying the ideals and teachings of the great leader to your own life effectively enough, or doing anything to undermine the cohesion of the collective group. And if all of that sounds incredibly vague, yes, that's the point. Everyone was subject to intense criticism. These self-criticism sessions always had to include a fault, a cause, a result, and countermeasures for even one's smallest betrayals to the party and the nation. And then after criticizing yourself in front of everyone, you'd have to turn and find something else to criticize someone else about immediately afterwards, in order to, draw attention away from yourself. This led to an atmosphere of distrust among neighbors and kept them from effectively organizing in any meaningful way, because there was just no way you could trust your neighbor to not rat you out the second that you did something wrong. From this then, the final component to Kim's system of power and control was also revealed to his people at this time: Juche. To explain this further, Juche, my friends, is an ideology that melds a viciously fierce Korean nationalism with a concept of national independence that focuses on self-reliance and giving one's all for their country, which sounds nice on paper, but it incorporates elements of socialism and communism while appealing to leftist ideals, while simultaneously being nothing more than a massive form of ultranationalism wearing communism as its overcoat. Being then equal parts authoritarian, nationalist, and incredibly racist, all wrapped up within the communist system. In other words, Kim would go and say that he supported socialist patriotism, which is just nationalism by a different name. Along with this, his use of authoritarian rule and cult of personality was akin to that you would see with Mao or Stalin, or even some fascist dictators. But even those two still stuck to a more traditional view of communist Marxism-Leninism. It would really appear that Kim simply used the framework of communism to get his people pacified, and then rejected most of Marxism-Leninism after the 1960s, when it began to be influenced by other countries, including Vietnam. But regardless, the core of Juche is that the Soviet model of communism couldn't be followed by everyone due to various historical and cultural factors unique to the Soviet Union. So he changed it to fit his people's culture in a better fashion. To explain this, the main differences between Juche and any other communist ideology is that it places ideology itself over materialism. Instead of the concepts of class struggle, Juche then wraps this ideology above all concept in the existing Korean cultural concepts of family lineage and nationalism, while still acknowledging and allowing social distinctions and existing hierarchies. This can be easily shown by the fact that the core class in the Songbun system has always been the upper class or elites of North Korean society, simply by being born into those families. In many cases, it's like an old feudal structure was just replaced with communist language, but everything else still remained the same. It's this kind of bizarre counter-image to the chaebol system that would develop in the South, where profit would matter over ideology any day of the week, yet the same Korean cultural limitations of family as status and nepotism would stay as active in both societies. There's also, on that note, weird similarities between Juche and the Syrian version of Baathism that the Assad family would use to great effect, but that should probably be a later video, which actually, on that note, we probably need to do a video in the future about political ideologies, their definitions, and history, because, dear God, the amount of people on the internet who do not know the difference between communism, socialism, fascism, and other types of ism is really insane. Either way, back to Juche though. Arguably, it is the intensity of the adherence of Juche that set the ideology apart from other political ideologies. The feelings of devotion, fanatical enthusiasm, and fervor portrayed by North Korean people in years past has been considered by many to be simply, political theater. It's something that is designed to maintain the Songbun status. But this is a rather reductionist viewpoint, as there are 25 million people in North Korea, and millions of them are legitimately devoted to the regime, kind of like a religion. This has been told to us by North Korean defectors who spoke of pretending to be so excited, happy, sad, ecstatic, etc., while they knew that people to their left and right were legitimately buying it in most cases. There is no religion, there is only belief in the state. Another core concept of Juche is the concept of a sacred great leader. This is borrowed from both Christianity and Confucian ancestor worship, and it also has many similarities to Japanese Shinto, which is a religion that considers the Japanese emperor as being a divine being. In this case, it's not an emperor, it's Kim Il-sung, who is the divine leader, and it's the reason why, regardless of the fact that he is no longer alive, that Kim Il-sung is still considered the great leader of North Korea. Juche also has similarities to religion in that there are rituals involved. These involve every household having a wall that has absolutely nothing on it but a picture of the past and current Kims who have ruled North Korea. These must be cleaned regularly in order to show devotion and respect, and if humidity causes mold inside of the picture frame, that could be a strike against you. Just as bad was if there was dust on top of the picture frame, because every so often, government officials would randomly show up at your doorstep and demand to inspect your pictures of the leaders immediately. If something was wrong with them, you're screwed. Other rituals would include the weekly self-criticism sessions, as well as various festivals and parades that were held in honor of the leaders, and the very participation of the people in these massive events that included sports, gymnastics, music, and dance, as well as military parades. All of this would show their dedication to the core concepts of Juche. Really, the most devious part of Juche as an ideology was that it took advantage of the fact that Korea had traditionally been a collectivist society, much like China. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, that kind of thing. Juche dials this naturally built-in cultural concept of collectivism up to 11 and essentially whipped up the North Korean people into such a frenzy that many citizens consider themselves as children of the great leader first and foremost before anything else. And so yeah, I know going on about this, we've been talking about this here for a while. We've been going on for so long about specifically Juche. And so this, my friends, is why we have been going on for so long about Juche. In order to understand how people could allow themselves to be treated in such a way, you have to understand their mindset and their motivations. For the North Korean people, their motivations are much the same as you and I. They want to raise their kids, they want to feed their families, they want to do all the basic things that everyone wants to do, yet when you look at their mindset, that's where the massive differences between North Korean people and the citizens of any other country become very obvious. Juche is what allowed Kim to rule over a population that did not understand the very concept of human rights. Now, we can get back to the rest of our story. So, Kim Il-sung creates a very tight system of control over his people, and for roughly the first 20 years of North Korea's existence, things were going relatively well, all things considered. Reminiscent of Mao's Great Leap Forward, Kim would go and implement a series of 5-year initiatives for his people to accomplish. They industrialized and built infrastructure projects. North Korean workers began to produce some of the largest and finest statues in the world. And this is something that can actually be exemplified by the over 500 statues of the Kim family that are scattered across North Korea, as well as some really ridiculous and crazy cool monuments, like that of the African resistance that they built in Senegal, or like the National Heroes Acre Monument in Namibia, or the King Behanazin statue in Benin, and the 3 Tikosi Monument in Botswana. They were really active in all these different places. At the same time all this was happening, the government would also place a large focus on developing a textile industry, and this led to the development of vinylon, which is the national fabric of North Korea. This synthetic fiber is produced from the reaction between polyvinyl alcohol and formaldehyde, and they made so much of it that Hamhung, North Korea is known as Vinylon City, which sounds incredibly cyberpunk. But anyway, The material is resistant to heat and chemicals, and it's still used to this day for the vast majority of North Korean textiles, vastly surpassing the usage of cotton or nylon. This national fabric is used to make everything from clothing to shoes to ropes to quilts, and it's extremely versatile. The drawback, though, it's pretty stiff, and it's difficult to dye, but it definitely became a large part of the North Korean identity, and especially its industry. Industrial production would eventually return to pre-war levels by 1957. In 1959, relations with Japan had improved somewhat, and North Korea began to allow the repatriation of Japanese citizens in the country. The same year, North Korea revalued the North Korean won, which held greater value than its South Korean counterpart. In fact, until the 1960s, economic growth was higher in North Korea than it was in South Korea, and the North Korean GDP per capita was equal to that of its southern neighbor as late as 1976. I make a lot of criticisms here on this channel, but it's one of those fascinating things that you have to understand that states were not always rich or poor or vice versa. An internal CIA study acknowledged various achievements of the North Korean government in the post-war Korean era. Compassionate care for war orphans and children in general, a radical improvement in the status of women, free housing, free healthcare, and health statistics, particularly in the life expectancy and infant mortality rates that were comparable to even some of the more advanced nations, at least that being said right up until the North Korean famine. Yeah, life expectancy in North Korea was 72 years of age before the famine, which was only slightly lower than what you would see in South Korea. The country once boasted a comparatively well-developed healthcare system. Pre-famine North Korea had a network of nearly 45,000 family practitioners with some 800 hospitals and 1,000 clinics. Meanwhile, at the same time, South Korea was suffering under the rule of a military junta led by Park Chung-hee, supported by the United States, and it would not really see economic success and the true tiger economy of Korea growing until the 1970s heading into the 1980s. For 20 years, North and South Korea were comparable, and arguably in the very beginning, North Korea was actually doing slightly better. At the same time, all this is happening, beginning in the 1970s, a decision was also made to have Kim's successor be his son, Kim Jong Il. The younger Kim would be assigned as director of the country's propaganda department, and he was really committed to this role. Like, when I say that, this culminated with the younger Kim ordering the kidnapping of a famous South Korean actress and director who happened to be married and forcing them to make movies for him for the better part of a decade, culminating in a massive Godzilla ripoff set in feudal Korea. But that story is way too long and dramatic to tell, though if you'd like to hear that story in full in a later video, definitely low in the comment section below. However, Godzilla ripoffs are not going to save the country, and by the 1980s, the economy had begun to stagnate. It started its long decline in 1987 and almost completely collapsed after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. This being when all Soviet aid was suddenly halted because, go figure, the country no longer exists. And that, my friends, is when the country turned into the one that you have probably already seen in documentaries with hidden camera footage. The fall of the Soviet Union would also coincide with the worst tragedy in the history of North Korea, the death of its great leader, Comrade Kim Il-sung. Shortly before noon on the 7th of July, 1994, Kim Il-sung would collapse from a heart attack at his residence in Hyeonsang, North Pyongyang. After the heart attack, Kim Jong-il would order the team of doctors who were constantly at his father's side to leave and arranged for the country's best doctors to be flown in. After several hours, the doctors would arrive, but despite their efforts to save him, Kim Il-sung would die at 2 a.m. July 8th, 1994, at the age of 82. After the traditional Confucian mourning period, his death was declared 34 hours later, and the people of North Korea lost their shit. You yourself have probably seen a number of videos or pictures of the state funerals held in North Korea. Kim Il-sung's death resulted in nationwide mourning and a 10-day mourning period, which was declared by Kim Jong-il. His funeral in Pyongyang was attended by hundreds of thousands of people from all over North Korea. Citizens would show up in the tens of thousands to grieve and honor the great leader, and people were passing out left and right in distress. Openly weeping was nearly universal. And while some of them were surely amping up their grieving performances, most of the citizens were genuinely distraught. A lot of this was not fake. Their near brainwashing because of the Juche ideology was basically complete, and it would show its greatest outward emotion right here. It was almost a primer for the rest of the decade, which would put the nation to the ultimate test of survival. But first, before any of that, Kim Il-sung's body was to be placed in a public mausoleum at the Kumsusan Memorial Palace, where his preserved and embalmed body lies under a glass coffin for viewing purposes. His head rests on a Korean-style pillow, and he is covered by the flag of the Workers' Party of Korea. In total, the mourning period for Kim Il-sung officially lasted 3 years from the anniversary of his death. From there then, Kim Jong-il would take over leadership of the country, as previously ordained, and the rule of this Kim was going to be marked by 3 things. First, interestingly enough, the new leader had a great love of American cinema and Hennessy cognac. Secondly, he was obsessed with getting a hold of nuclear weapons, much like his contemporary, Muammar Gaddafi. Third, he wasn't a very good ruler, and he came into power as the country would suffer the worst crisis in its history, the Great North Korean Famine. Yes, while Kim was playing games with the UN nuclear facility inspectors, his country was facing a living nightmare. Their number one supporter had been Soviet Russia, and without the trade, imports, and food production provided by the Soviets, the bottom just fell out of the North Korean economy. It went into complete freefall, and the people of North Korea would suffer. The government didn't completely ignore the famine and would refer to it as the Arduous March, in reference to a battlefield legend about Kim Il-sung. Even in their desperate suffering, everything had to be about the great leader. But there's more to this Arduous March than just the Soviets not supporting them. The problem was also with North Korean geography. You see, less than 20% of North Korea's mostly mountainous terrain is arable land. Much of the land is only frost-free for 6 months, and only 1 crop can be grown on it per year. The country has never in its history been self-sufficient for food production, and many experts consider it unrealistic for the country to ever try to be. Due to North Korea's terrain, farming is mainly concentrated on the flatlands of the 4 western coastal provinces, where there is a longer growing season, level land, and substantial rainfall. This, combined with well-irrigated soil, allows the high cultivation of crops. But along with the western coastal provinces, fertile land also runs through the eastern seaboard provinces. But interior provinces, such as Chagang and Yangon, these are just simply way too mountainous, way too dry, and way too cold to really support any kind of farming. This was all multiplied by the sudden loss of Soviet economic and food aid. But there's something else the Soviets had that the North Koreans didn't, and that is oil. You see, without Soviet aid, the flow of imports to the North Korean agricultural sector completely ended, and the government proved to be too inflexible to respond to it. Energy imports fell by 75%. The economy went into a downward spiral, with imports and exports falling in tandem. Flooded coal mines required electricity to operate pumps, and the shortage of coal worsened the shortage of electricity. You can kind of see where this is going here. Agricultural reliance on electrical-powered irrigation systems, artificial fertilizers, and pesticides, all of these things were particularly hit hard by the economic collapse, which in turn made everything significantly worse. Now, for a time, China would fill the gap left by the Soviet Union's collapse, and they would prop up North Korea's food supply with significant aid. By 1993, China was supplying North Korea with around 77% of its fuel imports and 68% of its food imports. However, in 1993, China would face its own grain shortfalls and need for hard currency, and from there it would sharply cut aid to North Korea. In response, Kim could have come forward to the United Nations and the international community, hat in hand, and requested aid to avoid the suffering of his people. He could have. But, if you remember from earlier, and why we explained everything that we did about Juche, the ideology of it is so incredibly aggressively based on self-reliance that this is impossible. It's like a theocratic state renouncing the existence of God. You cannot do that. This would cause him to refrain from requesting international economic aid, and it was only made worse by the fact that most of the Western countries had already placed trade embargoes on North Korea in years prior for both human rights violations as well as Kim's attempts to get nuclear weapons. So, the government sold the famine as something that was occurring around the world, and therefore it was completely unavoidable. Like, there's no way they could actually do anything because everyone is being affected. When it wasn't. The government even went as low as to put forth a let's eat only 2 meals a day program to try and stretch out the available food supply to last longer. Most people in the rural provinces had no choice and were lucky if they actually got 2 meals a day anyway. But still, in an ideology that stresses self-reliance and one's own ability, if everything goes wrong, that naturally means that someone has to be at fault. And so Kim needed a scapegoat to distract attention from himself. So he would shamelessly accuse Sol Kwon-hui, the North Korean Minister of Agriculture, of spying for the American government. He then had the man publicly executed by a firing squad. What really kicked the famine into overdrive, though, were the floods in the mid-1990s that would occur. Independent international observers described them as being, quote, of biblical proportions, and washed away as much as 30% of the nation's arable topsoil. One needs to understand that that means that even after the flood, the land that previously could have been arable was now largely not arable. As devastating floods would ravage the country in 1995, arable land, harvest, grain reserves, and social and economic infrastructure were just all destroyed. The United Nations Department of Humanitarian Affairs reported that between the 30th of July and 18th of August 1995, torrential rains caused devastating floods in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In one area, in Wonsan County, in northern Hwanghae Province, 877 millimeters or 35 inches of rain were recorded to have fallen in just 7 hours, an intensity of precipitation unheard of in this area. Water flow in the engorged Amnok River, which runs along the Korea-China border, was estimated at 4.8 billion tons over a 72-hour period. Flooding of this magnitude had not been recorded in at least 70 years. End quote. The major issues created by the floods were not only the destruction of croplands and harvests, but also the loss of emergency grain reserves, because many of them were stored underground. According to the United Nations, the floods of 1994 and 1995 destroyed around 1.5 million tons of grain reserves, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention stated that 1.2 million tons, or 12% of grain production, was lost in just the flooding. There were further major floods in 1996, and this was then followed by a drought in 1997. Dear God, the weather just hated North Korea for these 3 years. And so that's just it. The North Korean government could not handle this. North Korea lost around 85% of its power generation capacity due to flood damage to infrastructure such as hydropower plants, coal mines, and supply and transport facilities. Around 70% of the power generated in the DPRK came from its hydropower sources, and the serious winter-spring droughts of 1996 and 1997, and a breakdown on one of the Yalu River's large hydro turbines, created major shortages throughout the country at the time, severely cutting back railway transportation, which was almost entirely dependent upon electric power, which in turn resulted in coal supply shortages to the coal-fueled power stations, which supplied the remaining 20% of the power in the country. But wait, it gets worse. Because then, my friends, the food distribution system completely breaks down. Because here's the thing, my friends, you need to understand exactly how food distribution within North Korea would work. Because remember again, the majority of food that it was going to get was imported, meaning it went to the capital. In an absolute state of chaos, the government would get food and supplies in Pyongyang, and then they used to ship them out to all other portions of the country. But this began to crumble, and slowly but surely, those who lived in the rural provinces began to stop receiving food. Food was also still being handed out based on the Songbun status. Those in Pyongyang and the surrounding area of the capital, they were mostly of the core class, so their access to food was mostly secure, and they didn't suffer nearly as much like the rest of the country. But the further out of the capital you went, the more likely you were to be one of the lower classes. And from there, things were about to get real bleak in the mid to late 1990s. The extended period of food shortages put a strain on the system, and it spread the amount of available food allocations thinly across the population, affecting 62% of it, who were entirely reliant on public distribution. This system was only feeding 6% of the entire population by 1997. Inadequate medical supplies, water and environmental contamination, frequent power failures, and outdated training all led to a massive healthcare crisis that added to the overall devastation. And guess what? It only gets worse. Inadequate medical supplies, water and environmental contamination, frequent power failures, and outdated training led to a healthcare crisis that added to the overall devastation. According to a 1997 UNICEF delegation, hospitals were clean, but wards were completely devoid of even the most rudimentary supplies and equipment. Thermometers, scales, kidney dishes, spatulas, IV administration sets, etc. The mission saw numerous patients being treated with homemade beer bottle IV sets, which were not sterile. There was an absence of oral rehydration solution and even the most basic drugs such as simple antibiotics. And yet, guess what? And I know you're tired of me saying this right now, things still get worse. In 1996, it was reported that people in the so-called better off parts of the country were so hungry that they ate the corn cobs before the crop was fully developed, which, as you can imagine, this reduced the expected production of an already ravaged harvest by around 50%, sending child malnutrition rates skyrocketing. Child malnutrition, which is indicated as being severely underweight, was found at 3% in 1987, and this would skyrocket all the way up to 14% by 1997. Pregnant and nursing women would face severe difficulties in staying healthy, maternal mortality rates would increase to approximately 41 per 1,000, while simple complications such as anemia, hemorrhage, and premature birth became common due to vitamin deficiency. And God forbid you have a child with a birth defect in North Korea, because in past decades, they have been euthanized shortly after birth by the state. This is actually why you'll never come across a North Korean with something like cerebral palsy or muscular dystrophy or something like that. They physically do not let these children grow up. Children, especially those under 2 years old, were most affected by both the famine and the poverty of the period. The World Health Organization reported death rates for children at 93 out of every 1,000, over 9%, while those of infants were at 23 out of every 1,000. Undernourished mothers found it difficult to breastfeed. No suitable alternative to the practice was available. Infant formula was not produced locally, and only a small amount of it was ever imported. Even then, if any supplies were to be had, the military was given priority when it came to food, because for decades, the military has been used to build infrastructure projects around the country. The army was supposed to find ways to grow food, to feed itself, and to develop industries that would permit it to purchase food and supplies from abroad. The rations received by military personnel were very basic, and ordinary soldiers of the million-strong army often remained hungry, as did their families, who did not receive preferential treatment simply because their son or daughter was serving in the armed forces. People began to struggle to find food, period. Every animal that ran, flew, scurried, or slithered was caught and eaten by the population. Some resorted to hiking up to the mountains to gather food like roots and berries. Eventually, when all those were scavenged, they resorted to eating such things as grass soup or wild vegetable porridge and grass roots. These provided next to no nutrition, and during this time, people would begin to die in the thousands of starvation. In fact, so many people would die during this period that it created a fourth untouchable caste in North Korean society, the Gochebi. These were the thousands of homeless children who resided in the streets of North Korea, begging and scavenging for food. The exact number of deaths during this acute phase of the crisis from 1994 to 1998 is uncertain. According to the researcher Andrei Lenkov, both the extreme high and low ends of the estimates are considered to be inaccurate. In 2001 and 2007, independent groups of researchers estimated that between 600,000 and a million people, or 3 to 5% of the pre-crisis population, died due to starvation and hunger-related illnesses. In 1998, U.S. congressional staffers that visited the country reported that, and I quote, "Therefore, we gave a range of estimates from 300,000 to 800,000 dying per year, peaking in 1997. That would put the total number of deaths from the North Korean food shortage at between 900,000 and 2.4 million between 1995 and 1998, end quote. W. Cortland Robinson's team would find 245,000 excess deaths, this being an elevated mortality rate as a result of premature death, 12% of the population in one affected region. Taking those results as the upper limit and then extrapolating across the entire North Korean population, that would produce an upper limit of 2 million famine-related deaths. Now, it could have been as high as 3 million, but was most likely around 2 million. So that's the number that we're going to tentatively go with. And for a country of 26 million people, that is a huge chunk of people to lose to anything. But for it to be because of a famine and not a war or a plague or something else like that is what is truly insane here. And so looking at all of this, as we're trying to then explain why it is that North Korea now seems to have a tourism industry that is trying to build, you're probably then wondering, why is it that Kim was able to fund a nuclear weapons development program while his people were starving to death in the thousands every day? Well, this is because he developed an international criminal organization that trafficked in such things as counterfeiting, money laundering, growing and distributing opium, heroin and meth, and various other illegal activities. He had farmers growing crops of opium while they struggled to find food for their families, and he poured tons of money into developing the best counterfeit operations in the world. He called the division of government he created to run these operations Office 39, and within a couple of years, they were the best US dollar counterfeiting operation in the world. This office also ran the largest counterfeit cigarette operation in the world, and North Koreans would grow and roll tobacco that would then go to China, where Chinese smugglers would get it into America and into convenience stores that were owned mostly by those from the communist and Middle Eastern countries. Weird times. Combined with their drug operations, this would bring in the regime somewhere around $1 billion a year. That is billion with a B, by the way. And he used that money to fund his efforts to obtain nukes. Meanwhile, the people of North Korea continued to suffer, all in the name of getting more dollars. And so it is here at this time, my friends, that we discover the rise of the most interesting part in this entire story, the rise of gray market capitalism in North Korea. A gray market, sometimes called a dark market, but not black market, is the trade of a commodity through distribution channels that are not authorized by normal channels. A black market is one that operates in counterfeit goods, but a gray market is one that operates where it's not supposed to be allowed. Because North Korea is a communist government, free trade is supposed to be illegal. But during the famine, the people weren't just going to stand by and starve without trying anything first. By 1998, North Korea's GDP was only around 60% of its 1990 level. Most state-owned industrial enterprises just completely stopped functioning by this time as well. Although the North Korean government did demand that male employees report to work, even if their enterprises were not actually running. This policy was officially justified with the rhetoric about the need to protect socialist property and to prepare to resume production after overcoming the crisis. In reality, the government was probably seeking to keep track of its people and to avoid potential unrest and political problems. The requirement to be present at one's workplace did not apply to women, though, and any married woman could register as a housewife, which allowed her to not appear at work and to some extent loosened the government's control over around half of the adult population's daily life. Perhaps then, not surprisingly, it was women who would spearhead the growth of the new private North Korean economy that quickly took shape in the 1990s. The situation in many ways resembled the beginnings of the 1990s in post-Soviet Russia, when state control yielded to massive privatization. But it was even more extreme in North Korea. To obtain food, workers started to remove and sell or barter anything of value from their plants, manufacturing goods of their own at home. From this then, product markets quickly began to spring up in downtown centers of North Korean cities. Small markets and vendor stalls began to pop up in city centers randomly. Some people ran businesses out of their homes and would barter goods for food with their neighbors, whom they knew they could actually trust, which was rare in society. These pop-up markets and businesses began to be referred to broadly as jangmadang, and it flourished rapidly. Eyeing higher profits, traders would create sophisticated networks and enlist smugglers to bring in highly lucrative foreign commodities, including trending fashion, technology, media and information sources, and items like coffee, beer, chocolate, and Coca-Cola. Some traders even began to sell shares of their operations. Today, many North Koreans understand that they can buy anything they want as long as they have the money. And that money, well, it better be green and from the US. Yeah, that's right. The jangmadang runs solely on dollars. That's another reason the government dislikes it. Towards the end of Kim Jong Il's rule, however, the regime made many efforts to rein in and even eradicate the jangmadang, including banning the trade of some foodstuffs in 2005, setting restrictions on traders' age in 2008, and in 2009, forbidding foreign currencies and devaluing the nation's currency in an effort to destroy traders' private wealth and close down the markets. But then 2011 rolled around, and the dear leader, Kim Jong Il, would die, most likely of a heart attack. Since then, the regime has been actually far more accepting of the jangmadang, lifting many restrictions on the market under Kim Jong Un's supervision. To that end, today, the jangmadang have come to hold a nebulous semi-official position in the eyes of the DPRK regime. They know that the country can't survive without the jangmadang, but it really hates to acknowledge or encourage it. And they really hate to acknowledge that women are still the vast majority of the business owners in the jangmadang. Because of wild fluctuations in the value of the North Korean won, business owners in the jangmadang trade in dollars because of the stability of the currency, as well as the currency exchange rate favoring them if they do business in dollars from beginning to end of sale. The North Korean won has suffered from some insane inflation in past years, and it is seen as way too volatile to bet one's entire business enterprise on. Like, that just can't happen. Illegal private fields were also developed in order to grow crops on inclines that the government had considered to be too steep to grow on previously. And remember, since this is a communist Juche society, if the government thinks that it's not going to be done, that means that it's not going to be done and you're not allowed to try. These fields exist in open sight, and many North Koreans from villages and small towns will literally just not show up to their regular job for weeks or months at a time to go work on these fields, where they can get paid a reasonable living wage or grow some of their own food. And the crazy thing is that these fields, which the government had considered unusable, yielded between 150 to 200% of the fields approved by the government and planted in better soil. These private ones just did way better. Why did party officials let these fields stay in operation? Well, because they were starving too. They were starving when these operations began, and by now they know that the country needs them to continue to survive. In other words, what began as a necessity during the famine has now come to represent a large portion of the country's real-world actual GDP. And if the government banned the Jangmadong, the regime would quickly just be toppled. Maybe not from the peasants themselves, but internally, as some officials would understand why they are necessary. Today, the Jangmadong system has grown to play a central role in the economic life of the North Korean population. As of 2015, an estimated 83% of North Koreans aged 16 or older participated in the markets, which saw the average of around 10,000 visitors across the country every day. These Jangmadong markets are even visible by GPS thanks to their trademark blue tarp roofs. As many as 730 large markets and many more smaller scale operations are estimated to exist inside of the country today. An estimate suggests that as much as 3/4 of the entire population are dependent upon this system for their very survival. As it is, Jangmadong is the outlet for around 90% of the North Korean household expenditures, and an average trader's earnings reach a level 80 times higher than formal sector wages, where an average month salary is 26 cents. In addition to acting as the bedrock of economic livelihood for most of the population, the markets also serve as financial centers that boast a range of important practical services. Visitors can go here to borrow money, exchange currencies, invest in community commercial operations, seek employment, and hire services in industries ranging from transportation to beautification to whatever. These evolutionary developments in the market system provide important opportunities that have enhanced the economic life and general well-being of the population. Really, what's crazy to say is that after Kim Jong Il died, this growth occurred to such an extent that his successor, Kim Jong Un, now leads a regime that has had to get really creative to find ways to make money since they can't break up the Jangmadong markets. So, their latest initiative has been one of the most unexpected industries you could possibly imagine from North Korea after everything I have described: tourism. Without getting too much into Kim Jong Un's rule, considering that we have pretty much talked about everything prior to him, we can summarize by saying that he's carried on much of his father's legacy, including developing, testing, and firing nuclear weapons repeatedly over Japan and causing much anxiety amongst Western leaders. Kim began promoting tourism, though, after the United Nations imposed severe sanctions in 2017 and banned all of his country's main exports, including coal and textiles. The sanctions were designed to strip North Korea of the means of earning foreign currency to finance its nuclear missile program. But they did not affect tourism, which Mr. Kim saw as a new source of very sorely needed foreign currency. He started numerous projects in the last decade, and these are best exemplified by the Kalma Beach project, which has been nicknamed North Korea's Waikiki. Yeah, this from a beach where the military used to run artillery drills. It has now been transformed into a beach resort that Kim Jong Un has very high hopes for. And initially, the project was actually a success. But wait, hold on, this is the late 2010s. Something is about to happen. I swear, I'm missing something. Oh yeah, right, COVID. Yeah, the COVID pandemic hits right as soon as North Korea decides that they want to get into tourism, and the pandemic led to North Korea shutting down its border and dried up any tourism dollars that potentially could have been coming in from the country. In fact, Chinese tourists to North Korea numbered around 300,000 per year prior to this, and that just all but disappeared. Instead, with no money coming in whatsoever, the half-baked tourist projects that were being created remained unfinished or empty during the entire period. The country would eventually reopen its borders in 2023, but then they closed them immediately again in 2024, and then opened them briefly at the beginning of 2025, and currently now at this time only allows Russian tourists, which Russia has its own economic problems, so that's not exactly a great plan. Yes, recently Russia has allowed its citizens to travel to North Korea again since they offered soldiers and aid in the war against Ukraine. But China still has not allowed its citizens to freely travel back and forth yet, and the regime has stayed closed off since early 2025 to visitors from any other countries. It's kind of crazy to think that they plan to develop tourism when they can't even keep their borders open to visitors regularly. But, then again, the Kim regime has done crazier things here in the past. But still, Kim is not going to be deterred. He poured more resources into tourism, and in early July of 2025, he opened the new and improved, expanded coastal resort dubbed Wonsan Kalma Coastal Tourist Area, which resides on North Korea's eastern coast. The complex includes multiple hotels and resort areas with water slides, pools, and shopping malls. All of the trade conducted in this and any other North Korean free economic zone is to be done in dollars, of course. Because guess what? Even the North Korean government would rather do business in US dollars than their own currency, understanding the value of it. Really, my friends, the best example of why the government has to tolerate things like the utilization of dollars and also Jangmandong is probably something like restaurant. And so really, my friends, when we go and describe all of these things, the best example probably of why the government has to tolerate the Jangmandong as well as the utilization of dollars is probably from restaurants. Privately run cafeterias and restaurants would eventually come into existence within North Korea because state-run eateries largely ceased to exist or operate from 1996 to 1998 due to obvious famine reasons. And to this day, the state only runs a handful of North Korean restaurants. Private eateries have quickly replaced public ones, though it remains impossible to receive official permission to open a restaurant or cafe. In practice, an investor who wants to open such an establishment makes a semi-official agreement with local authorities to register the business as a state-run enterprise. In most cases, the businessman, or I guess rather businesswoman, since women actually continue to play an outsized role in private economic activity, is appointed the director of the restaurant. That person then goes and hires staff, purchases equipment, renovates the premises, and starts operations. Part of the gross receipts may even go to the state and be technically listed as public sector revenue. In addition, the owner usually pays local authorities and other public officials who offer to protect the business as a kind of bribe. So, to simply feed the population, the government heavily relies on Jangmandong capitalism to accomplish its goals. They can't do without it because their state means of distribution have still never truly recovered from the famine, and the Jangmandong is too much a part of society by now. And so the thing is, if they're not providing the population's needs or providing them services, then that means by definition, if we're going by ideology here, North Korea is not really a communist government anymore. With no distribution system really effective, it fails in every regard for that. It is, and bear with me here while I go deep into political ideology for a second, a totalitarian dictatorship disguised as a communist country that is a socialist dynastic necrocracy simultaneously enabled by Juche and gray market capitalism. The people aren't still eating grass in the countryside. They know what computers are. They don't have the internet, but many are aware of their existence, especially those who live close to the Chinese border. A North Korean living in Pyongyang in 2025 might go eat at a privately owned restaurant, then go watch the latest South Korean K-dramas while enjoying a Dr. Pepper. That is all possible, even if it is semi-illegal or outright illegal, but basically ignored by the government. And many of them understand how their country is perceived by the rest of the world. So, my friends, this leads to the ultimate point of this video. The development of the Jangmandong has caused the North Korean regime to loosen the reins that it holds on the population. And the more that it does so, the more the regime is threatened with protests and popular uprisings breaking out. Once that occurs, there is no going back. The government of North Korea will look unrecognizable compared to its former communist glory. And no matter how many tourist resorts and attractions that Kim Jong Un builds and opens, each one of them takes him closer and closer to the end of his regime in a cycle that he can't really undo without a crackdown on his people that would look more like an ethnic cleansing and probably start a revolution to overthrow him anyways. So, really, It's weird to talk about this, but the opening of a water park is one of the clear signs of the end of days for the Kim regime. Not now, not immediately, but the days of the regime are numbered, and it's nearly a safe bet to say that if Kim remains in power somehow, some way, it will be as a ruler of something new and different, and not anywhere near as restrictive as the current form of government. In other words, Kim would need to bring in capitalist reforms that resembled those of China in the 1980s and 90s. And it just doesn't seem that the concepts of Juche would allow Kim to denigrate or lower himself to that level. And so that, weirdly enough, is why tourism, free trade, and women, from all of that combined, will likely spell the end of the North Korean regime sooner or later. But with that, my friends, we're going to end things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate you all very much. I know this was a bit of a long one. Definitely a long one, as we had a lot of different things here to cover, but, this required a lot of background. So thank you all very much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. And if you want to join us on any of our trips, we're not going to North Korea, though that ironically would be a very fun thing for me to try and plan for a trip here in the future. You never know. We could go to a water park, maybe. I'm leading a trip to Thailand here in January, and the link for that is down in my description. You should definitely sign up, and let's all go on an adventure together. Goodbye, my friends. See you next time, and best of luck to you.